In the previous video, we talked about how the LSAT engine course is going to work and how important the LSAT is. Now let's cover some basic information about this test. The LSAT's offered 4 times a year in February, June, October, and December. It's usually administered on the first Saturday of the month at 8:30, but in June it's administered on a Monday at 12:30 in the afternoon. You should plan on taking the LSAT in the second half of the year before the year that you're planning on going to law school. So an LSAT taken in June, October, or December of this year would be great if you wanted to start law school in the fall of next year. Virtually all law schools have a policy called rolling admissions, which means they're accepting applications on a continual basis throughout the application window. This means that it's always better to get your application in sooner than later. Say for the sake of example that I'm the head of admissions at Georgetown Law School, and each year I have 500 empty seats that I can fill with new students. If I get an application in September at the beginning of the cycle, and I have 500 empty seats to give away, I'm much more likely to take a chance on that student. Whereas if I get that same application in February, and I've given away 400 of my 500 seats, I'm probably less likely to take a chance on that student, and I'll be looking for someone with stronger numbers. So the application window runs from September to March 1st, and it's always a good idea to try to get your application in the beginning of the cycle. June is a great time to plan on taking the LSAT because if you're not ready for whatever reason, you can postpone to October or even December and still get your application in at the beginning or in the middle of the application cycle. June is especially good if you're on the semester system because you'll finish school at the beginning of May and then you'll have that whole month from May to June to really gear up for the test. It's a little tougher if you're on the quarter system because you'll be in the middle of finals when the LSAT comes around. October is the most popular test date. It's taken by more students than any other test, and that's probably because you have the entire summer to get ready for it. October is especially good if you're on the quarter system because the LSAT comes around right when you're starting school again. If you're on the semester system, the LSAT's going to kick in right around the time your first set of midterms comes due. And finally, the December test date is almost nobody's first choice, but it's still a fine test to take. It puts you right in the middle of the application cycle. December test takers are usually people who were gearing up for June or October, but decided to postpone. And finally, the February test is the least popular test date. It would make you really late for the current application cycle or really early for the next application cycle. And so few people take the February LSAT that the company that provides the LSAT actually doesn't release this exam. The long and short of that is that if you don't do as well as you wanted to in February, you won't actually get a copy of your exam back to know what you missed. The reason they do this is because they recycle the February LSAT. So few people take it that they use this test again for students who need to take the test under special conditions. So that's when the test is offered. Now let's talk about what's actually on it. The LSAT's made up of 5 sections of multiple choice questions and a writing sample, each of which lasts 35 minutes. The first 3 multiple choice sections come back to back for an hour and 45 minutes straight of testing. And then you get a 15-minute break. The last 2 multiple choice sections are also back to back. That's another hour and 10 minutes. The writing sample is 35 minutes for a grand total of 3 hours and 45 minutes of testing. And that first hour and 45 minutes is especially brutal. That's why I'm going to encourage you to study in 2-hour chunks so that you can develop the mental stamina necessary to focus for 2 hours. This writing sample at the end, though, it's just a 2-page essay that gets passed along with your scores to the schools that you apply to. It's not actually factored into your score. Your score comes from the 5 multiple choice sections. They're what really matter. And they average roughly 25 questions apiece, so your score is going to come from roughly 125 multiple choice questions. But not all 5 sections count. One of the sections is an unscored section called an experimental section, so really only 4 of the sections count. I want to talk about the 4 sections that count first, and then we'll talk about that experimental section. So you're going to get 2 logical reasoning sections. Logical reasoning questions give you a little passage of information, and then ask you a question about it, and you get 5 answer choices to choose from. They might ask you to weaken an argument or strengthen an argument or what must be true based on some facts. So you're going to get roughly 25 of those in each logical reasoning section. You're going to get 2 logical reasoning sections that count. You're going to have 1 section of reading comprehension. This is going to be the most familiar. It's a lot like the SAT or the ACT. You'll get 4 passages with a bunch of questions, 5 to 8 questions for each passage. And they'll come from subject areas like science and law and the humanities, a diverse area of topics. And finally, you're going to get a logic games section. This is going to be the weirdest section. You're going to get 4 logic games with rules and multiple questions associated with them. And the logic games ask you to either arrange items in an order or put items in various groups and follow the rules while you're doing it. This starts out as most people's worst section and ends up being most people's best section. There's a lot of improvement that can be made on the logic game section. So those 4 sections total roughly 100 questions, and those are the sections that actually count towards your score, but you're going to get one extra section. You're going to get a third logical reasoning section, or a second comprehension, or a second game section that's going to be unscored, and it's the LSAT's way of testing out new questions for future administrations. So you can't tell where it is. It can be any one of the 5 sections. It can be any one of the 3 section types, and you just have to do it. So on test day, there are actually going to be 5 total sections, 4 of them that are real, that count towards your score, and 1 of them that's unscored, it's experimental. Let's talk about how this test is scored. So there are 4 sections that actually count towards your LSAT score, and they total roughly 100 questions. First thing that happens after you take the exam is they compute your raw score. How many out of this 100 questions did you get right? Then you get compared to everybody else who took the test on the same day, as well as students who've taken that section as an experimental section on previous administrations. So you might be taking the test in December and somebody saw one of your sections in June of the previous year as an experimental section. And they compare you with those folks too to make sure that the test is fair from administration to administration. There's no way that a June exam would be harder than a December exam or vice versa. This is a process called equating to make sure that the test stays fair. So they compare you to everybody from your same administration as well as to people from previous administrations, and then they figure out your percentile and assign you a score somewhere along this curve. This is a score scale from 120 to 180, and it's a standard bell curve, or for you stats geeks, this is a Gaussian distribution where 70% of the population is going to fit between a 140 and a 160. And each score along this scale corresponds to a certain percentile. For example, a 160 would put you in the 80th percentile. A 164 would put you in the 90th percentile. So let's take a look at some significant scores along this curve and talk about what kind of schools they would get you into. A 152 is as close as you can get to an average LSAT score. It puts you in the 52nd percentile, meaning you did better than 52% of the population. And it averages minus 40, so if you get 60 out of 100 questions right, you're looking at a 152. Now, when I say it's average, I mean for people who've actually studied. Most people, when they take their first exam without studying, start somewhere over in the 140s. But for people who've prepared, a 152 is average. And this isn't enough to get you into a Tier 1 or Tier 2 law school. It's not enough to break into the top 100, but it will get you into a Tier 3 or Tier 4 law school. To break into the top 100, you're going to need something like a 160, which will put you in the 80th percentile. Now you're doing better than 4 out of 5 test takers. And you can get a 160 while still missing 27 questions. So if you get 73 out of 100 right, you're looking at a 160. Now you're competitive at schools almost into the top 40. We're talking about schools like Baylor or University of San Diego or Florida State would accept a 160. If we move up to a 164, just 4 points away, now all of a sudden we're talking about the 90th percentile. Now you're doing better than 9 out of 10 test takers. And you can get that 164 while still missing 20 questions. If you get 80 out of 100 right, that puts you in the top 10%. And suddenly you gain access to schools like Emory or George Washington University. You could get into Boston College or Boston University or the University of Alabama with a score like this. A 164 is a pretty good score. A 170 is an amazing score. It would be great. It puts you in the top 3% of test takers, and you can miss 12 questions and still get this. So this would be like a B in school. You'd be like an 88 out of 100, but it puts you in the top 3% of LSAT takers, and this gets you admission to all but maybe the top 5 law schools. It would put you at or above the median for everything except for like the Yales and the Stanfords and the Harvards. For those, you might want a 173. That would put you in the top 1% of test takers, and you can miss 8 questions and still get there. If you get 92 out of 100 right, if you miss 8, you'll have a score that makes you a top 1% candidate. So you might have noticed that you can miss a fair number of questions and still get a really good score. And that just goes to show you how difficult this exam is. Even students in the top 1% miss 8 out of 100 questions. These are really hard questions. So this might be a humbling experience if you're used to having things come quickly and naturally. Most students miss a lot of questions at first, and it takes a while to get better. Another element that makes this test so difficult is the timing. 35 minutes is not going to feel like enough time to complete these sections. So getting quicker is a big part of getting better. And you're going to do that by working procedurally. You're going to do things the same way over and over again until they get quicker. But when I sat for my first real administration, I didn't get to the end of any section that I can remember. I think I guessed on the last one or two in each section. I still ended up with the 173 though, because I did well on the questions that I got to. And so we're going to emphasize accuracy over speed. It's important that you get really, really accurate before you worry about ratcheting up the speed. Oh, and by the way, those guesses are always a good idea. There's no penalty for guessing here, and so you should never leave a question blank. You should have an answer for every question on your test, whether you did it or not. After you complete the LSAT, you'll be given the option of canceling your score. You get 7 days to make this decision, though, so you never want to pull the trigger right away. You should always sleep on it. And when you cancel your score, you won't know what you got, and they won't know what you got. The schools that you apply to will be told that you canceled, but that's it. And one cancellation on your record isn't too big of a deal. Several cancellations makes you look a little bit flaky. So the only reason you would cancel your score is if you're sure that you underperformed. If you were sick the night before and you didn't finish sections the way you normally do, or if you blew the logic game section and that's normally your strong suit, you might consider canceling. And that's because law schools say they look at all of your scores, and some law schools average your scores together, and you wouldn't want a low score dragging any future scores down. However, like I said, most law schools these days focus on your best score. It used to be the case that they all average, but these days, most schools just focus on your best one, and especially if you beat your first score by 8 to 10 points, they ignore that low score and act as though you got the high score. So you don't have to worry too much about averaging, and unfortunately, the policies vary from school to school, but you can always contact the schools that you're thinking of applying to and ask them whether they average scores or simply look at your best. They're pretty open about their policies. You're allowed to take the LSAT up to 3 times in any 2-year period, but don't count on sitting for every administration. You've got to sort of pick and choose, and this is a kind of test where you really just want to take it once and be done with it. So if you haven't already, it's important that you sign up for the LSAT as soon as possible. You do it at this website, www.lsac.org. That's the Law School Admissions Council. They're the ones who host the LSAT. And the reason you want to sign up sooner rather than later is because test centers fill up quickly, and you don't want to be assigned to a center an hour or more away and have to drive on the morning of the test. And if you have a couple of test centers near you, it's important to choose the best one. You might go to Google and Google LSAT test centers near your city, or go to this website, lsatcenters.wikia.com. They have a lot of reviews there about which centers are better. But some centers are definitely better than others, and I want you to sign up for the best one available. If you have any other questions, shoot me an email. Otherwise, I wish you good luck, and I look forward to helping you dominate this test.